All right, I'm going to get started. We got a lot to get through today. So next week, I told everybody last week, you saw in the email, next week I'll be up here with Jimmy King, who went to school here in the early 90s and played on the men's basketball team, was part of the well-known Fab Five. And we don't have anything structured planned. Jimmy tells stories. He'll take questions about anything. So it should just be a good conversation. He's a pretty inspiring person to be around. So in a way, this is really my last lecture here. It is about numbers, but in a way it kind of brings together everything that we've been doing in the course, as you'll see. And the way that I want to do it is actually by sharing with you, numbers happens to be what I'm working on right now in my research, numbers in sports and the growing importance of numbers, especially in basketball. And I don't know how often in the humanities or elsewhere you guys have an opportunity to kind of see how your professors think about what they're doing. I'm going to begin by talking about it in a kind of unusual way very briefly, because in a way it's a very personal research project, although I didn't really know that until after I'd started it. So I'm going to start with that. That's my father, who was a scientist. This is him probably in the early 50s maybe. He was a PhD in biochemistry, and he taught in a medical school, and he was also a fantastic mathematician and statistician. He was from Spain, and this is about as close as he got to basketball. This is a book he had. It's an official rules book for basketball from 1946 that he had and that I got after he passed away. So he was not an athlete, is what I'm trying to say, and he was not American. And so when I was growing up, sometimes that made for some difficulty in trying to kind of connect with him and us with each other. We were very close. And ultimately, this is how he connected with me. Every basketball game I played, from, I don't know, whenever I started, 5th grade or something, through high school, he kept stats. And then in the mid-'80s, when personal computers became a possibility, he got a personal computer and he started feeding stats into that computer. And he really loved numbers, and he passed on to me a love of numbers, although he understood them far better than I did, and he had more confidence in them than I do, which is part of what I'll be talking about today. And this is about 3 years ago, about 3 weeks before he passed away. We were able to catch a Michigan basketball game together, which is something that we always really enjoyed. I grew up in Madison, so he was a Wisconsin fan. But he started, as you can see, repping for Michigan as well. So some of what I'm going to talk about today with respect to numbers or quantification or analytics, I'll just be riffing off of slides, and some of it I'll be reading for you. What I'm going to start with is a short clip that was kind of the immediate. This is the deep personal inspiration for the work I'm doing. What I'm about to show you was kind of the immediate thing that sort of triggered my curiosity about this phenomenon. It comes from a TED Talk that was delivered in 2015 by a computer scientist named Rajiv Maheswaran.
So what we're doing is turning our athletes into, you probably guessed it, moving dots. So we've got mountains of moving dots.
So Maheswaran, around that couple years before he gave that TED Talk, founded a corporation called Second Spectrum. This is from their homepage. And you can see, just reading briefly, what they do. They're basically a data servicing corporation that not only gathers data, but processes it, and in a certain sense, I think the kind of most important part of it from my point of view is right here. They look for ways of crafting stories from the data that they gather and process. They are now pretty much the premier corporate player in this space, primarily associated with the NBA, but their products are also making inroads in the WNBA, in college sports, in soccer, and in hockey as well. So that's how this came about and what it might mean from the point of view of the humanities is part of what I want to share with you today. So counting, which is what we're talking about, is not new in basketball or in sports. This is a drawing of the very first basketball game ever played in 1891, and the inventor of the game, James Naismith, counted the one basket that was scored in that game. He recorded it in his diary. Over the next 100 years, the number of plays counted changed. The number of plays considered worth counting changed, but the methods really didn't change. Scorebook from 1899, scorebook from 1983. You can see there's greater complexity in the right-hand image. But the basic idea was the same. You'd have a courtside scorer who is tallying plays and making a mark in this kind of grid. And then the results would be totaled in the form of a box score. Here's one from 1983. And the box scores would be published, as you know, in newspapers and in the media, and they were shown to kind of be of interest to fans and useful from the point of view of providing a kind of rough snapshot of the game's action for those who missed it. But they were not really considered very serious kinds of analytical tools, and most experts were well aware of their limitations. So, for example, a sports writer from the New York Times, this is written in 1973, writes that the statistics, no matter how elaborate, leave out the very things that count: when and how, in other words, context. So this is, as I said, 1973, and that gap, when and how, in a way, is what the rise in numbers, in advanced analytics and statistics, has kind of grown up to try and supply. First in baseball, in the 1970s, baseball is a more linear sport than basketball or some of the other ones that analytics has taken hold on now, and so it is more amenable to advanced statistical analysis, because in some ways it's less complex. So you all have heard probably of Moneyball, book, movie, and phenomenon. The baseball abstract was kind of what got that movement going. A hobbyist named Bill James began to think about the kinds of numbers that were recorded in baseball and how relevant they really were, and to look for other kinds of patterns. And basketball analysts followed suit shortly after. Over the course of the 1980s, these were mostly just hobbyists, basketball fans who were statistically or mathematically adept, who used personal computers to access historical data, just box score data, and began to kind of manipulate that data and look for patterns and new ways of counting, new things to count, and new ways of manipulating what had been counted. One of the kind of premier pioneers in this was a guy named Dean Oliver. 1991, he published a little article just on a personal website in which he used a different scoring system. So you remember the scorebooks, which just kind of leave out the when and the how, just make a mark every time somebody scores a basket or misses a free throw or makes a personal foul. Each line here is a possession. And so Oliver began to watch games and to record the statistics for games by keeping track of a possession. So left-hand side is the score, right-hand side are the teams. I mean, the third column here, these are teams, LA and Detroit. These are the player number along with some kind of coded symbol to indicate what's happening to the ball during that possession. All right? So you can see that this can give you a lot more information. It's basically a coded version of what you would see as you watch the game. Right? Okay. So this is Magic Johnson. Here is dribbling the ball. 4 is probably Byron Scott. Gets the ball, then James Worthy, back to Byron Scott, then to Magic, etc. Okay. On the basis of this, Dean Oliver and others communicating like in online forums and so forth on the web during the 90s, began to develop some new concepts, statistical concepts and metrics. So the most basic of these and important is the possession, the period of time between when one team takes possession of the ball and when it loses possession to an opponent. That's important because it provides a kind of stable point of reference for comparing players who play for different teams or at different eras. All right? Some teams play faster, some teams play slower, and so the number of points a player scores in a game is not necessarily that significant unless you know how fast they play. So that's pace, the number of possessions per game. From this, in a certain sense, they redefined winning. Of course, there's a final score. But statistically speaking, the meaning of the final score is that you have outscored an opponent given an equal number of possessions. Right? So on the right here is the points per possession for the Oregon-Michigan game from a week ago or so. And you can see that Oregon slightly outscored Michigan per possession. Efficiency is the number that's being given there, the ratio of points per possession. And efficiency is going to be an important word. It's a very important word for analytics, a very important word for me, because, for example, as I was saying earlier in the semester when I was bitching about lecturing, part of the reason I have to lecture is because of efficiency. That is maximizing the number of students per faculty instructor, right? It would be less efficient economically to just have 10 of you sitting here to talk with. Oliver and others then kind of started to break down patterns in the data in terms of possessions, pace, winning, etc. And they came up with what are called the 4 factors in basketball that they determined were most strongly correlated with winning. In other words, if you win in these categories, you are likely to win the game. Not always. It's just a strong correlation. And you can think about the categories. Effective field goal percentage is the percentage of field goals you make, but it is weighted to account for the fact that 3-point shots count for more. Okay? Turnover percentage is the percentage of your possessions that end in a turnover. Offensive rebound percentage is the number of available offensive rebounds your team gets. And then free throw rate is how often you get to the line. All of those are important because they provide opportunities to score in a given possession. So if you get an offensive rebound, that's still part of the same possession. You've given your team another chance to score in the same possession. All right, so these are the 4 factors breakdown for that same game, the Michigan-Oregon game. All right. So by the early 2000s, analysts were developing complex, quantitative, descriptive, diagnostic, and predictive models like this one, which is of the expected cost and gain and efficiency of various elements of individual and team play. As the expanding internet helped spread these insights in the public domain, NBA franchises took note and began to hire data scientists like Daryl Morey, who's now the general manager for the Houston Rockets, but was at that time just at MIT, to analyze statistical data. So you can see how complex this gets. This is way beyond my level of math chops, though it would have been meaningful to my father, I'm sure. So as vital as all of so far we're just talking about statistical methods, applying existing statistical methods to the data provided in sports. As vital as these innovations were, in fact, over the last decade, through the use of digital technologies, all of this counting, in a sense, and data analysis has been turbocharged in basketball. So I'm going to show you a video which is already outdated. That's how fast this goes. This video is from a couple years ago, but it's outdated. NBA franchises now employ digital surveillance technologies like these to track the movements of players and the ball 25 times per second, in effect serving as a prosthetic enhancement to human counting capacities. So whereas in 1991, human observers counted around 600 individual actions performed by the players in an NBA game, today this sport view technology counts 800,000 actions in every single game. So I'm going to give you a visual impression of the result now. part of what they begin to see is you can break down, and this is just rough, you could actually get far more granular data than this, the expected shot value for different kinds of shots on the court, right? So you can see getting close to the rim is still the most valuable place on the court, but by comparison, you can see as you move out up to the three-point line, the numbers go down, and then you get to corner threes, which is the closest area of the three-point line in NBA basketball, you start getting close to what it is to get near the rim. And free throws, though they look not so valuable because they're only worth 1 point because of their high percentage, are also quite valuable. This is another way to represent this. Red is hotter, in other words, more valuable. Green is cooler. All right? It gets better, though. So I'm going to show you a video, very short video. It's just 9 seconds long. It's a play. Left-hand side is the TV broadcast of a game between the Spurs and the Cavs. And on the right-hand side is a visual simulation using the SportView technology of the same play. So you can see the players' numbers represented there. Cavs are in yellow, Spurs are in white. The graph on the bottom is charting the expected point value of the possession in real time as the play unfolds. And it will vary depending on the decisions that the players make, okay? It shoots up right here when he dishes out to the corner. All right. So this kind of ability to analyze what works and what doesn't in such a kind of finely grained way has really transformed the business of basketball and is beginning to transform the business of other sports as well. You can see, for example, this is the percentage of field goal attempts that have been three-pointers. Beginning in 2009, 2010, starting in 2011, there was SportView in 5 arenas. And you see a little bit of a jump, and then SportView in, that shouldn't be 25, it should be 15, sorry. And then in 30 arenas, and then the numbers keep going up with really, there may be a point at which they kind of level out because teams are now responding to that defensively. But the point is that it's changing players' tactical choices on the floors, coaches' strategies, personnel decisions that general managers make when they're drafting or thinking about trading, and even the skills that young players are practicing more than any other these days. So that when I go to the playground in Oberlin, I won't see a kid shoot anything inside the three-point line unless they're at the basket. Everything is beyond the three-point line. Whereas when I was a kid playing, there was no three-point line. So there was no value in taking a shot further out. That was not part of the game. It wasn't a skill that I developed as a player. So this surveillance technology, the SportView stuff, is kind of off the chain, but it is nothing compared to this stuff, which is wearables, which some of you are probably intimately familiar with. So these biometric devices measure physical attributes and gauge player movements, plotting them against ideal movement patterns. The devices track and quantify in fantastic detail the movements of players on the court and the conditions of their bodies. And their companion software helps clubs or colleges turn this data into actionable information. In fact, the narrator of this ad for the biometrics firm Catapult states the value of this quantifying technology. He will be saying, I'm not playing the sound, he says, what you can measure, you can manage. So the athlete's body is the thing to be measured. All right. So in all these ways, analytics, counting, and refined technologies for gathering data and counting and so forth and processing it have in a way begun to fill in that when and how that I was telling you was missing from statistics in the past. And that leads Rajiv Maheswaran, the CEO of Second Spectrum, to declare in that same TED Talk that we have quantified what was previously unquantifiable. And I encourage you to go to the Second Spectrum site. They've got videos, and you can see some of their products. And they are really very imaginative. They're very appealing visually, and they are incredibly optimistic and positive thinking about the value of what they're doing. As far as they're concerned, there is nothing that can't be quantified. This is one of their video ads. It's amazing, right? I mean, it's incredible what they're doing. So, what they're able to do explains why this happened last fall. The NBA paid them $250 million to be basically the official compelling story generator of the NBA. So that Sport View stuff that I showed you, it's out. Second Spectrum is installing its own cameras into every arena. They'll be there by the beginning of next season. And every team will get its software packages from Second Spectrum. Of course, each team has its own analytics department that will do different things or ask different questions of the data they get. So that's where the differences will come in. So what I want to do now is to begin to contextualize this a little bit. Like, I'm really amazed and fascinated by this. There's lots of this that I really love. But I also question a lot of it and wonder what kinds of things aren't being considered. One way to think about this is that Maheswaran refers to what he's doing as the science of moving dots. And so you can imagine that from my point of view, I'm thinking about, well, what about the culture of moving dots? Right? Those moving dots meaning the players, okay, which they turn them into. But those players for me are also human beings. So what about their side of the story? So these are the basic elements that basketball analytics brings together. Advanced inferential statistics, that's the early stuff. Digital data acquisition technology, that's the cameras. Machine learning, that's where they begin to feed that data into machines and use neural nets and artificial intelligence to begin to teach computers to recognize the difference between a ball screen and what's not a ball screen so that it can begin to offer you predictions about different outcomes. And then the visualization technology that you just saw. All right. So check this out. This is Maheswaran. Each dot here represents one of 450 NBA players, and the size of the dot corresponds to the height of the player. This thick white diagonal line runs through all the players who make 47% of their shots. The chart correlates shooting ability with the probability of the shots, and Maheswaran, and here's where I get to context, explains the value of this kind of analysis. I'll go back to it for a second, if I can. Let's see what happens here. Okay, this should be that chart. Yeah. So here's what Maheswaran says. It's really important to know if the 47, so he's referring to a human being who makes 47% of his shot attempts in a basketball game. It's really important to know if the 47 that you are considering giving $100 million to is a good shooter who takes bad shots or a bad shooter who takes good shots. So right there, for me, I see that the value of this primarily is for owners, because they're the ones writing that $100 million check. And Daryl Morey, who I mentioned earlier, who's now the general manager of the Rockets, said something similar before, about 10 years ago now, that the aim of analytics and of all of these technologies is to generate wins for less dollars. So basketball analytics, in a sense, and I think this is true for other sports as well, has in effect developed and delivered to owners powerful tools for maximizing the value extracted from the league's labor force. So this is not necessarily the story that gets told in the popular literature and culture about analytics. So you can see commercialization and profit being an additional component driving this. If it was not making money, it would be dead in the water. The popular literature includes a kind of emphasis on objectivity and on competitive advantage in the marketplace and on the field, an improved product for fans, the ability for players to develop their own skills and increase their value in the market. And then, of course, in this story, most of these kind of popular stories tell a tale of some kind of stat geek who just really loved sports, never got on the field, but really was a fan, and is able, through the kind of persuasiveness of the objective methods that he commands, is able to kind of make his way, to get the ear of a general manager, and then from there to wind up running a team and sitting in the skybox alongside the owners. So that's one way the story gets told, right? Through these colorful figures that are bucking conventional wisdom and using scientific methods to improve player performance, fan experience, and the owner's bottom line. Going more deeply, there's another story that is kind of latent. It's unstated or implicit in this. And in that story, the real hero is science itself, in the form of quantification and digital technologies and statistical thinking. And that deeper story tells us that knowledge always progresses for the betterment of everyone. There are no losers in science. Whatever may be the genuinely positive contributions of analytics to sport, the trend clearly enjoys an aura of objectivity and benefits from what historian of science Theodore Porter has called a deep-seated cultural inclination to trust in numbers. So in this way, the widespread acceptance of analytics derives from the convergence of several factors, which I described: the competitive emotional investment of partisan fans, the commercialization of sport, the traditional authority of numbers, science, and technology, and this is an important one for all of you going out into the world, the contemporary assertion of the overarching importance of efficiency, of productive efficiency, whether athletically or economically. And all of this is happening in the era of big data. So you're probably familiar with the term big data. This is just a kind of schematic of some of the, of its reach, let's say, and of the components that put it together. It's sort of everywhere. I mean, you're on your phone. If you are on your phone right now, you are connected to this, okay? Even in the humanities where I work, it's kind of ridiculous. So I'm not going to go into detail about this, but you can see, like on the left-hand side, what will probably be meaningless to you, but here you've got a big data machine learning tracking of various patterns in English poetry. And on the right, emotional patterns in the text of the Iliad. Higher education, that is to say, clearly you can see data being used in all of these areas. Your performance, the university's performance, my department's performance, my performance, teaching strategies, everything. Inefficiencies down here in the administrative process, but not only in the administrative process, as I have belabored throughout the semester, also in terms of the classroom. So the use of big data has inspired criticism from some, not many, about inequalities of power in the big data kind of ecosystem. And some of those inequalities have to do with how the data is acquired. Some of it has to do with how data gets turned into stories about us, those of us who are supplying the data, about what we love and hate, what we have done, and especially what we are likely to do next. So that's why when you're on Facebook, ads pop up telling you to think about buying something, because they're thinking you're likely to buy that thing. And then finally, in terms of who gets the data and what they're going to do with it. This is an article about the Michigan's Jumpman contract with Nike. And this is a quote from Nike. Metrics can be harvested, include speed, distance, vertical leap height, maximum time in aloft, shot attempts, ball possession, heart rate, running route. And here's some of the questions that some people are asking about that. Who's going to wind up with that data? Ostensibly, it's there to benefit players and teams, but data is just data. As data scientists endlessly tell you, that data, what gets done with it depends entirely on who has it and what kind of story they want to tell. So I started out talking about counting. This is kind of the short history of counting in sports. I'm also interested in what counts. Right? The word to count doesn't just mean to enumerate, it also means to be significant or to matter. And so I'm interested in the other side of this as well in my work, and that is kind of what I want to turn to now. What counts? So you remember this picture. You can think about this as a difference between quality and quantity. Okay? Quality meaning the kind of something, quantity meaning the how much of something. And it's clear that sports has built into it a kind of interest in quantity. After all the quality that unfolds over the course of a basketball game winds up getting translated into the quantity of the final score, right? So when the women's team from Michigan just won the women's NIT, there's a final score there. But that final score doesn't necessarily communicate everything that unfolded over the course of the game and the overtimes that decided the game. That side is the quality, that's the quantity. And there's some question from a humanistic point of view about that gap right here between those two things. And one philosopher has argued that these two orders, you can't put them together. There's no way to make them match up, and so we have to rely on quantity. It's our only kind of foothold into the sort of bewildering, chaotic world of the quality of a sporting performance. And I do think we need some kind of way to rationally grasp what we're seeing. Otherwise, we're just kind of like taking it in without any sort of sense of understanding of what's happening. But I don't think that quantification is the only way to do that. In fact, I'm going to give you an example of a different way of doing that in a minute here. So this is James Naismith, who invented basketball. And in 1914, I think he provided a really nice description of what it is to watch a basketball game, of the quality of play. I don't mean quality in the sense of good or bad, remember. I just mean the what of something rather than the how much of something. And I think his description, which I'm going to share in a second here, is actually really a good kind of way into thinking about other ways of connecting to sporting experience that aren't numbers. Okay? The main interest in basketball, this is Naismith writing in 1914, lies in watching the kaleidoscopic changes which take place. Every moment of a game is full of thrills when expert players handle the ball. We watch such a game with an increasing admiration for the wonderful capacity of the human frame for accomplishing the seemingly impossible. No amount of rough work, even if it should result in a goal for our side, can compare with such a spectacle. It is indeed, he says, a narrow mind that puts goals before grace, scores before skill. So grace and skill, those are qualitative terms. Goals and scores, those are quantitative terms. Okay? And Naismith is telling us, this is the inventor of basketball, is giving us a way of thinking about what we might be looking for when we watch a game. And it's not just basketball, of course. Grace is also important to other philosophers who think about the beauty of sports, their aesthetic value. And, for example, here. And one of them, who I don't think we've read in this term, is a literary critic, a guy named Hans Gumbrecht, who describes grace as a function of how distant a body and its movements appear to be from consciousness, subjectivity, and their expression. So it's a little bit like what Naismith was calling reflex actions, what some of you might call being in the zone. It's that sense or muscle memory, for that matter, right? Subjectivity, consciousness, etc. That's where you are thinking consciously about doing stuff. This guy's describing grace as the body doing those things. Whether or not the athlete is thinking about it, it doesn't look like it. Okay? All right. So, let me see. Okay. So Gumbrecht, who is the author of this quote about grace, and Naismith, who wrote the description that I read a moment ago, remember when we were talking about bodies and embodiment? I think part of what they're describing here is successful embodiment, okay? Where, as for us, in awkwardness, injury, illness, and death, we can experience embodiment as inconvenient or even agonizing demonstrations of our human limitations. In basketball and in sport more generally, we can see uplifting and inspiring experiences of embodiment. So that basketball, two players vying for a rebound here, or several, can come to seem like an art form if you think about it from a certain point of view. So athletes can cultivate grace, or what you guys might call muscle memory, through mechanical repetition in practice. You do the same thing over and over again, and then when you're in a game, you don't have to think about what you're doing. Your body already knows. But it looks different from our point of view as spectators. For spectators, switch that up. This is going to be fun. For spectators, grace exerts an aesthetic fascination. It's beautiful because it is exhibited unpredictably in order to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. That's incalculability. And this incalculability, or as Naismith put it, lack of any preconceived plan or grace, is what makes of basketball, for me, no prettier sight in athletic achievement. Leonard Koppett, who talked about statistics earlier, said, "Any knowledgeable crowd will cheer louder for a fancy pass behind the back or through the legs that doesn't lead to a score than it will for a routine basket." Koppett also used the word style to talk about this experience that a knowledgeable crowd might respond to. In the context of what we're talking about here, we can see that the importance has to do with embracing rather than minimizing risk. Okay, in every one of those plays you saw a player making a play that analytics would tell you was not the right play, unlikely to turn out successfully, right? But what is so marvelous about watching sports is exactly the moments that the odds are beaten by an individual decision or even by a team. So I want to finish today in these last 10 minutes with a look at how this works in a very concrete case of one of my all-time favorite players, Allen Iverson. Right-hand side, these are just conventional measures of Allen Iverson's greatness, okay? You can see he has honors, single-season rankings, all-time statistical rankings. 6 feet tall, 165 pounds, maybe that big, all right? One of the most exciting players ever to play, but not according to analytics. So I created a metric in memory of my father. I kind of became a mathematician, and I thought to myself, all right, how do analytics see Iverson? They see him as a ball hog. So I created a number to quantify that. The ball hog index correlates individual monopolization of the ball through a metric called usage percentage with the individual's contributions to team success. So if you have a higher BHI, it means you're more of a ball hog. So you can see AI over on the right is more of a ball hog than the league average, than the average player. And that is why the authors of one book said not only is Iverson not one of the best players in the league, not only is he not one of the best players in the league, he's generally not even been the most productive player on his own team. For in basketball, they said, wins are solely a function of offensive and defensive efficiency. And Iverson's efficiency measures are below average. So in this way, basketball analytics assessments of efficiency in quantitative terms have shifted the criteria we use to assess the on-court value of players of the past, like Iverson, and the playing styles they're seen to embody. But this has more than just a consequence for how we think about the quality of players on the floor, because basketball players, like soccer players, like gymnasts, like anybody, are also cultural icons, as you have seen throughout this course. They're important to us for more than just what they do on the court. And so to move AI to the side, to consider AI, Iverson, below average, can be really significant considering that he is the icon of what was widely called the hip-hop generation in professional basketball. Particularly admired by a younger consumer demographic, younger and more black in the course of the 1990s and early 2000s. Players like Iverson and Michigan's own Fab Five were raised in the late 70s and early 80s when America's urban areas were being decimated by public policies. And these players no longer bought into a kind of civil rights era belief in the possibility of a kind of accommodation within the system. And so instead, they were more outspoken and assertive, both in terms of their kind of voice in the public arena, but also just in terms of their style and their clothes, their hair, etc. For NBA executives, these players, like Iverson or the Michigan's Fab Five and others, promised both a lucrative new market of younger consumers, but they also threatened to collapse the global empire built on the racial crossover appeal of Michael Jordan. And many people who study the history of the league see the league's policies during this period as a kind of assault on blackness that sought to monetize the street credibility of players like Iverson while policing their public persona and private behavior, for example, through the NBA's dress code, in ways that would avoid alienating the white majority fan base. So from this cultural and historical point of view, AI, to me, though he may be a ball hog, from the analytics point of view, is as important as a whole series of African-American players who pioneered any number of actions on the court and off the court in NBA history. Now I'm going to show you some AI playing ball, and I'm going to read you. So you remember the book that said Wages of Wins. This is a book that said AI is not even average. He's below average. So a very popular writer, Malcolm Gladwell, who I quoted earlier in the semester because he wrote the 10,000 Hours book, he was writing a review of Wages of Wins. And I'm going to just read you some things from his review while you get to watch Allen Iverson. Because who doesn't want to watch Allen Iverson? Gladwell struggled to sustain his appreciative vision of Allen Iverson, who, in his words, quote, would charge toward the basket over and over again, twisting and turning and writhing through a thicket of arms and legs of much taller and heavier men. But though these images may have been stirring to Gladwell, in the end, he retreated soberly from their lure, ceding ground to the unavoidable reality of the numbers. All we learn, he concluded dismissively, watching Iverson, is to appreciate twisting and turning and writhing. We become dance critics, blind to Iverson's dismal shooting percentage, and his excessive turnovers, blind to the reality that the Philadelphia 76ers would be better off without him. So that is how Iverson looks to somebody who is kind of drinking the numbers Kool-Aid, right? I'm going to introduce you to a technical term as part of my farewell. The term is ekphrasis, and in literary studies it just means a verbal description of a visual object that you might find in a poem or a novel or something like that. But that's not what it originally meant. In ancient Greece, it meant speech that brings subject matter before the eyes. So it might be somebody recounting a historical battle for those who were not there as a means of trying to inspire a city to make a decision or something like that. I want to emphasize down here that in that context, good ekphrasis did not mean a faithful representation of what had happened. It wasn't about an accurate portrayal. It was about how vividly could you imagine the thing and make people imagine it, and how strongly could you make them feel whatever you felt watching that event. So I'm interested in this particular piece of language, this kind of language, ekphrasis, because I think it's so relevant to sports cultures. We use it every day when we are talking about the game we saw the night before to a friend who didn't see that game. We read about it in sports. We see it when we turn on TV broadcasts. We hear it, that is to say, when we turn on TV broadcasts. I think Naismith's description is a beautiful example of ekphrasis. Even Gladwell's description of Iverson, even though it ends on this dismissive note, was actually a really beautiful description of what you saw Iverson doing, twisting and turning and writhing and charging, right? It's really evocative against much bigger players. So I don't expect you to write this down. I don't expect you to ever use this word again in your life. But I want you to take away what I think is important about the word, which is that it's a kind of technical term for the importance of words, right? And that words can take us places we haven't been and make us feel things about those places or events that we haven't been to or seen firsthand. Kind of like the story I tried to tell you the first day of watching Dr. J's free throw line dunk with my friend Rob. It's a way of using words to fill in the things that numbers do not count. So I think of basketball analytics, of numbers basically, as a kind of language. And it is a very powerful language in this conversation, in the conversation of sports today. I want to encourage you in the process, though, of sort of taking that in today's culture, to think critically about it and take it with a grain of salt and recognize that for all its apparent objectivity, the objectivity we feel exists in statistics and mathematics and in science, those ways of knowing and of connecting to the world are also framed by individual biases, and they will emphasize and prioritize certain things and exclude other things, okay? And so in the process, I want to encourage you to balance numbers or quantification with the development and expansion of your ability to identify and appreciate everyday beauty, such as we encounter in sports, and to share that beauty in a rich variety of stories. And in short, to counter the growing pervasiveness of the language of counting with the many languages of what counts. And I really want you to come back next week and show Jimmy some love, because he is a University of Michigan treasure. And he is taking time out from his work day. He is not getting paid, just like he has never gotten paid, to serve this university. So I really hope you'll come out, and I know you're going to enjoy it. So thank you all. Thank you.